Hi, welcome to Cassie's Corner. My name is Cassie and I'm your host. And today I wanted to tell you about all the books that I read in August 2023. And I read 10 of them. And so let's go ahead and get started. So 3 of my books were on the 1001 books that you should read before you die. And I want to just go ahead and explain to you that the 1001 books is a lie. There are actually 3 different lists that mention these books. And so the actual amount of books is really closer to 1,200 books. But I've been trying to read through them. So I've been trying to read about 3 a month because that means I'd be reading 36 a year, which math says maybe 25 years before I can finish, because I've already read 100, so just wanted to say that up front. And the first book that I've read that I want to talk about this month is actually a really interesting book that's on this list. The book is called Cain, and it's written by Jean Toomer, and that is Jeantoomer. This book was published in 1923, and it's about the Harlem Renaissance, or at least he's considered a Harlem Renaissance writer. Before I talk about the book, I also wanted to mention that Giovanni's Room, the guy who wrote that, named James Baldwin, he actually got a lot of inspiration from Jean Toomer. So if you want to know a little bit more about him, Jean Toomer might be somebody to look into. So one thing about Cain is that it was really experimental. The writing was it was written in a collection of short stories, so they were like vignettes, right? But they were also like very like lyrical at sometimes. Sometimes it felt very rhythmical. Sometimes there was a certain refrain that would repeat over and over throughout the book. So this kind of repetition wasn't as extreme as it was in The Blind Owl, which is just another book that's on the 1001 books to read before you die list, just for those of you who've read it who need a reference. But these refrains and these stanzas would sometimes come up in these very lyrical, sometimes very poetic ways, and sometimes in a way that almost felt like jazz. Like there were these like just little bright flashes of color here and there throughout the page. So he really captured the experiences of African Americans somewhere from the late 1800s until the 1920s, and he has been praised by other African Americans, especially of his own time. I believe that he also knew Richard Wright, who wrote Native Son, as being having a very accurate portrayal of African Americans and the culture and basically their soul. And the way that he was able to capture that in prose was apparently extremely vivid. Now, something that I found about the book was that it was a little cluttered. It was hard for me to go from piece to piece because for me, I want things to be a little bit more structured. And so it was harder for me to feel like I was actually getting what he was trying to say. I did find a lot of the way he wrote beautiful, and I understood what he was doing with it, but in the case of me, it didn't really hit the way that I think he wanted it to for his audience. Now, I do also want to say that the content in this book, there's some very lighthearted content, and then there's some very serious content, which involves some of the worst things that you can think of that humans are capable of. So this is a book that I would say should come with some kind of content warning for those of you who are very sensitive to certain kinds of topics. There is SA involved and mentions of other forms of abuse and things like that as well. This book is definitely very soulful, it's definitely very unique. But I personally didn't find it accessible. So because of that, I did give it 2 out of 5 stars. Now I just want to kind of let you know that 3 out of 5 stars means it's good. I liked it. So 2 out of 5 stars just means that it didn't hit with me for whatever reason, but it's not a 1 star because I do see like why it's thought to be so good, right? So I just wanted to mention that. So the second book on my list that I read is called The Garden Party, and this is also 1001 books you need to read before you die. This was from a collection of short stories by Catherine Mansfield, and the collection of short stories was The Garden Party and Other Tales. So this short story collection just covers a myriad of different human experiences. For example, some of the themes are death, marriage, distorted reality, regret. She also talks a lot about gender roles, and that's kind of throughout the whole thing. For me personally, the story, The Garden Party, which is technically the one that you're supposed to read to meet that requirement on the 1001 books, I found it kind of a juxtaposition between life and death. So we've got one thing going on one side of, let's just say the page. No, I'm not saying the literal page, but metaphorically we've got one thing going on, and it's very lively and colorful and beautiful and all of that. And on the other side we have something that's very dark and dim going on. And so we have people living their lives, and then we have people dealing with death. And that juxtaposition is supposed to give us some cognitive dissonance. It's supposed to cause us to feel uncomfortable with what's going on. I personally thought that this method of writing was a good one. It's just not a good one for me personally. I recognized the skill, I recognized the literary prowess of Catherine Mansfield, but I just personally didn't like this story myself. I did think that it was a wonderful think piece, and I would recommend it to those of you who want to read the 1001 books to read before you die, especially for those of you who want to get a head start and start on the really short stories, because this one is a very short read. I did give this a 2 out of 5. But it's just because I've been reading so many really, really good books, you know. So the third book I read was also a 1001 books to read before you die. It's called The French Lieutenant's Woman, and it's written by one of my favorite authors. His name is John Fowles, and so I'll spell that name for you, Fowles. It was written in 1969, and this was a really fun read. It broke the fourth wall, which I thought was really ingenious. And it's kind of hard to describe, but what it is it's a Victorian novel, okay? Like, in all ways, I think everybody would look at this book and say, okay, that's a Victorian novel. So number one, it was a Victorian novel. And then it was also a Victorian novel that critiques some of the major themes and ideas that we find in Victorian novels. So that's what I mean by breaking the fourth wall. So it's self-aware, very self-aware. So we look at the conventions of the period. We look at, for example, some of the hyper-religiosity. We look at some of the gender roles, for example. He really highlights some of the ridiculous things about the times that really I hadn't thought about before, but some of the things that he talks about as he's writing this story is actually, you know, it makes me realize, oh my gosh, that is pretty ridiculous, you know. But it also tells a very beautiful and a very it feels like a Victorian novel. It feels like it's a Victorian novel that was written by a Victorian. It does not feel like it's maybe a commentary on Victorian novels or a commentary on people who read Victorian novels or a commentary on that. It doesn't feel like that. The novel itself has enough substance that it holds itself together as a Victorian novel. And the novel also has enough breaking the fourth wall and commentary on it that it holds itself also as a fully coherent essay about what the problems and some of the charms of Victorian novels and that kind of stuff. So it's really beautifully done in that way. This is a risk that was definitely a risk that worked for me, but it was definitely a risk. This man, John Fowles, he has written 3 very different books, and I love all of them. And I just can't tell you enough how much I recommended his books. I personally like The Collector by John Fowles the most of all of his books that I've read, but I intend to read all of his books, so maybe I'll be able to give you an updated one. So another thing about this, I would say, if there's an overarching theme, it would be a cross between belief and disbelief, and also between destiny and free will. And I think that he covers that very, very completely. There is a love story in it, and it also has a lot of charm. He goes out of his way to make sure that every element that he's put in this story is accurate to the time, and he just does a really, really good job. And in a way, it might even be considered a historical fiction with how much research he must have put into this book. I gave this book a 5 out of 5. I absolutely enjoyed it. I thought it was hilarious at times. I really got into the story. I was really attached to the characters. I felt that the characters were beautifully described. They felt real. I cared about what they cared about. And I really enjoyed that. So number 4, I actually have a copy of this book. I read mostly on my Kindle, so I guess I could have just held up my Kindle every single time I talked about one that I read on my Kindle. But this one's called The Cassandra Complex, Living with Disbelief. Okay, so this is by Laurie L. Schapira, and I won this book. I follow a Jungian on Twitter, and I really love Jungian theory. I think I had talked about that before, but I have a bachelor's of science in psychology, and I'm a huge follower of Jung and psychoanalysis, analytics, and that kind of stuff. So the Cassandra Complex, Living with Disbelief, is, as she puts it, a modern perspective on hysteria. That's actually a really good way of putting it. What she does is she goes through the Cassandra Complex and the different ways that myth has been told. She talks not only about the Cassandra Complex, like what happens when Apollo pursues Cassandra and how Cassandra kind of turns him down, and then, you know, the ramifications there, but she also talks about the Apollo, the Apollons, what are they called? The oracles of Delphi, who, according to myth, and I mean, these were actual women that actually lived and actually did prophecy, but they were filled with the light of Apollo. They accepted him in, and then they would prophesy, and people would believe what they said. And there are some historical accounts of them being extremely accurate. Anyway, the Cassandra Complex is really talking a lot about the anima and animus, these kind of instincts inside of us. And I want to be very clear that I'm not talking about male and female necessarily. I'm talking about male principles and female principles in their desire to unite, and how when we have a desire to push away one of these principles inside of ourselves, and also to push away the shadow, how that can cause a complex, and how Cassandra can heal herself from what happens to her. This was a very psychoanalyst heavy book. I wouldn't recommend it to other people unless you're really, really interested in psychoanalysis. And even if you were and you're not a practitioner, I would even recommend other people first, like Marie-Louise von Franz, who has excellent commentary on Jungian psychoanalysis. The Cassandra Complex, however, I did think was a very good book. It was very did talk about feminist and feminism, and it did talk about hysteria, and I gave it a 3 out of 5. I thought it was good. It achieved what it meant to do. I didn't have any problems with that one. Another book that I read, I just absolutely love this book's design, and it was more of a lighthearted read. This is called Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. It is written by Heather Fawcett, and I bought this book because I absolutely love the design, and I have a little place in my house where I have some different fairy decorations, and I thought that it would look really good next to it. Plus, I was interested in the book. Anything about fairies I'm going to be interested in. This was a really good tale. It was, I would say it was very accessible. I would say that it's something that I would feel totally fine sharing with my 16-year-old daughter. It's basically a young adult story about a woman who's researching fairies, and she hasn't researched a certain kind that's in a certain area of the world. So the area of the world that she hasn't researched, she goes there and she lives in a cottage and she starts researching the fairies there, and she kind of gets involved in several different kinds of little subplots that have to do with the fairies there. Now, she does write about dark fairies as well as the lighter ones. So we're not talking about Tinkerbell here when we're talking about the fairies explored in this book. We're talking about the fairies that we think of when we read the Celtic Twilight, the Irish fairies, the fairies that are kind of scary and mess with humans and that kind of stuff. So this does describe fairies as a dark force more so, and then it also includes some elements of just the fairy elements of spirits of the trees, so it has some animism in it as well. I thought that it was a fun read, but I didn't really get anything out of it other than just being really entertained by a nice kind of fairy story. And so I did give it 3 out of 5, but it was a really strong 3 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. So that is book number 5. I'm just letting you know we're at the halfway point. So book number 6 is Wayward, and I also have a physical copy of that. And if you look at this, you'll see that I have this little square here on my copy that it says BOT. That's Book of the Month. This is the little emblem that comes with your Book of the Month books. It's got a beautiful cover, which is one of the reasons why I ordered it. I really do like the way that covers look, but that's not the only reason why I'll order a book. But Wayward was one of my add-on bonus books for, I believe it was last month, the month of August, and I was really excited to read it. This is a book that kind of just goes into the surface level of 3 different women living at 3 different times, and their experience of a combination of the uncanny, so it does have some kind of witchy elements, and also their experience with the patriarchy and men treating them basically as less than people. I would say it does have somewhat of a content warning. There is some DV in it. There is SA in it, and so there are some kind of heavy topics. They don't really explore that so much as they explore the power of femininity and how women can take back their power and stand up to the patriarchy, and I really enjoyed that. Plus, the stories of the 3 women were good stories. I was interested in them. So this book I enjoyed a lot, but it was a lot like the Encyclopedia of Fairies in just that it was very surface level. I didn't really feel like I got to know on a deep level any of the characters. I was entertained by the characters and I believed in them, but I didn't really feel like I had an intimate knowledge of the characters. So I did end up giving Wayward a 3 out of 5, which is to mean that it was good. I really enjoyed it. I do want to talk about the next book, and I believe, let me make sure. Okay, so 3 of the remaining books are translations, so I just wanted to kind of say that up front. So the 7th book that I read is called The Shadow of the Wind. This was written by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, and it was translated by Lucia Graves, and I believe that this was originally written in Portuguese. This is one of those books that is intertextual, which is, I think the best book of intertextuality that I've found is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. And he's also the one that wrote Foucault's Pendulum, for those of you who are wondering if you recognize that name. So The Shadow of the Wind tells a story about a little boy falling in love with a book. And basically the whole book is kind of like a love story, 2 books. And but the actual plot is this boy falls in love with this book and he gets really interested in the author. And as a result, he starts researching about the author. Why aren't there other books by him? Why is this such a rare book? Why can't he find any other copies of the book, like to give his friends, that kind of stuff? And he kind of gets entangled in finding out the story of the author himself. And as he goes deeper and deeper into this story, there are some parallels between what's going on in the author's life and what's going on in his life. And those parallels may or may not have meaning at the very end. But something that I can say is that a vast amount of the story is told through secondhand knowledge. So, for example, he might interview somebody and then the whole chapter might be that person giving him their witness account of something that happened in this author's life, that kind of thing. One section of the book, for example, for a pretty hefty amount of pages, at least 20, is a written letter that he receives, and he reads it, and it has some of the mysteries that have to do with this author. Now, when I was reading this, I wasn't particularly interested in the mysteries. I kind of took the stance that I took with the character in Wuthering Heights, where it just seemed like this whole thing wouldn't happen if it wasn't for somebody just wanting to meddle in the lives of somebody else. And I did feel a little irritated with the main character as far as just how far he went in trying to figure out the mystery of this person that he didn't know. I understand the concept of being interested in somebody and then being interested in somebody who you really admire. But I also understand the concept of obsession, and I kind of felt like he went a little bit too far. And I felt like the other characters in the book didn't really keep that in check. It seemed like there weren't a whole lot of people in the book that were saying, hey, wait a minute, don't you think you're going a little too far? And it seemed like kind of strange that all of the other characters were kind of like, oh yeah, go ahead and do that, you know, like yeah, let's totally break into this house, for example, you know, and that kind of thing. So it's just, so some of that kind of didn't sit right for me, but I don't think the book was supposed to make sense in that case. I think that the book was supposed to talk about longing and about self-expression and about the way books touch us as people. The book had a really, really beautiful ending. I was at times very furious with the book, with how much I really don't like it when people meddle with my life. So I was really upset because the character was meddling so much in the life of this poor person, you know? So there were times where this book was a total 1-star. And then when I got to the end and I was like, oh my gosh. So some of that stuff that I had a irritation with, actually served a purpose. Then I was all like, oh my gosh, this is a 5-star book. So I really felt polarized about this book. And I can't overstate that enough, because I don't think I've ever felt so torn between what I should give a book as far as the star rating. I went ahead and gave it a 3-star. There are some times in this book that I was really angry with it. And then there are some times in this book where I just thought it was really breathtaking and beautiful. There are some beautiful quotes that stand out. And it's definitely worth it if you enjoy the intertextuality, and if you read this book with the idea that you're just going to be entertained. You know, if you're a person who wants to really analyze and try to nitpick every little thing, and you pick out continuity errors and things like that, this book might not be good for you. But it is clearly a very good book. A lot of people like it. If you were to go to Goodreads and look at the various reviews, very quickly you would be able to see the divide between the people who really loved it and the people that had some of the issues that I had with it. and you would be able to read without any spoilers exactly what those things are. But since I'm trying to keep this video kind of short, believe it or not, I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next one. But I do want to say again, I mean, I said this before, I gave it a 3 out of 5. But again, at some times this was a 1, at some times this was a 5. And that's just the way it is with that book. So the next book that I wanted to talk about is also a book that was translated. It was translated from Spanish to English by, well, the book is Paradise, and it's spelled Paradais, and it's by Fernanda Melchor. Okay, and it is translated by Sophie Hughes. Now, this book really hit me hard. Sometimes there are certain things we just can't explore in our lives because they're extremely unethical or they're just these terrible things. And one thing that this book does is it really pushes the boundaries of certain limits of who we are as humans, right? And there's this age group that a lot of people my age sometimes don't really want to think about much. And it's because they've got kids that are teenagers, right? So we follow these 2 teenagers, and so they're adolescents. I believe that they're both 16, although one of them might be 17, but they're both teenagers. And one of them is very, very privileged and lives in this house within a community called Paradise. Okay, so that's the community. It's a gated community. And the other one is a teenager who works there. Okay, and he just works as basically a handyman. He cleans things up. Sometimes he's a gardener. Sometimes he does, you know, odds and ends and that kind of stuff. And they're the same age. And these guys, they meet up. And, you know, because they're adolescents and they're boys, you know, there is some really heavy, like sexuality involved when they talk, right? And the sexuality isn't necessarily shocking because they're teenagers, right? And some of their delinquency isn't that shocking either. And, you know, it kind of feels at one point, like at the very beginning, kind of like a summer camp type feeling. Like I do actually believe that this happens over the course of a summer, but it might not. It might actually be happening during the school year or whatever. But this takes place in Mexico, okay? And these boys are just hanging out, and one of them is just this really gross, depraved, you know, boy who has lived with entitlement, and that entitlement's not checked. And the way that he is totally out of control with his behavior and his urges and his desires and all of that, it just has not been checked. These are basically unsupervised adolescents that are running around without anybody to be like, hey, that's actually not cool. You're not supposed to do that, right? And then the other one that is from a poor community, he has so many enormous forces going on in his life. He's got poverty. He has pressures from a broken family. He's got the pressure from some family dynamics that are very disturbing. And as you're reading this, you realize that these boys could really be anybody. Some of the dialogues these boys have, especially the super depraved, you know, you just don't even want to look at it, yet at the same time you do know that boys are having these kinds of conversations. Maybe not all of them, but some of them are. And it starts to dawn on you as you read more and more that some of the talk of one of them isn't just like, you know, hey, I really like this girl and I want to be with her and all of that, but that more like he is totally obsessed with her and he has become sexually stuck on her. And so both of these boys end up coming together to basically commit a crime, and the crime that they commit is absolutely horrifying. And this is all I really want to say. But one thing that I wrote down, obviously I have some notes here, was that this pushes the boundaries of humanity until it becomes something unrecognizable, but it's almost unrecognizable. And that's what makes it hit so close to home. That's why it is so haunting, because there is something that you can recognize within that. And that's kind of terrifying. A lot of people try to distance themselves using language by saying, you know, that person's an animal, from people who do horrible, horrible things, right? And we do that so that we can stay psychologically whole, because we don't want to think about humans being capable of doing some of these terrible things. But in this book, we've got humans doing terrible things. And because of that, it kind of forces us to face the fact that there is this aspect of humanity that is extremely destructive. And I was absolutely fascinated with the intimacy in which the writer was able to describe these two boys from two completely different backgrounds. I was really floored by the emotions that I felt when I was reading this, and I gave this book a 5 out of 5. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. So the 9th book that I have to tell you about was The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. I had heard about this book for so long, and I think I had ended up getting it as a Kindle Unlimited, but I'm not certain. I'm not like absolutely 100% certain on that, but it was on my Kindle, and I decided to just read it. I read it in one sitting. It wasn't hard to read, and it was so surface level. I mean, the plot was, everything was very surface level, okay? This book would be extremely entertaining if you're somebody who doesn't know anything about psychology, so you didn't care about the psychological accuracy. And if you're somebody who just really wants to be entertained, and that's it, you know? This book is actually would be a good book for a lot of people, and I could definitely see why it has so much hype around it. It's just, it totally wasn't mine. It did not it did not hit me in any way. It was something that I found extremely predictable. It was something that I felt uncomfortable with how I know how well this book's done, and it makes me think, like, I'm actually uncomfortable with how little the general public knows about some of these psychological issues, because some of the situations that happened in the book just wouldn't have possibly been, it was just impossible that would have happened if it had been, like at one point she sees a therapist, and a therapist would have never done what the therapist does, right? So there's certain cases in here that it's just makes it completely unbelievable for me. And for me, unless it's a fantasy story, unless I'm purposefully reading because I think that a book is just for entertainment and that's it, I generally will critique it and will be kind of harsh on it. And I recognize that about myself. I am a harsh critic. And because of all the hype, I guess I just thought that this was going to be more of a literary book than it was going to be like just kind of a mystery book. So that said, I gave it 1 out of 5 stars. However, I mean, I think that it was fun, definitely. And I can definitely see why people like it. It's just, I like to have a really immersive, intense experience with my books, and I didn't find this immersive or intense. So the last book is Blindness by Jose Saramago. This is also a book that was translated. It was originally written in Portuguese, and it's translated by Giovanni Pontiero. Jose Saramago won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1998, and I don't know for which book or if it was just a collection of books that he had written, but I did know that he was an award winner. And when I found Blindness, I know I had heard somebody had talked about it. I think it was my brother. Somebody had talked about it to me a long time ago, and I thought, oh, I think that might be on the 1001 books to read. So I did a quick search for just the title, and I was like, it came back up. So I decided to read it, and Unfortunately, the book that is on the 1001 Books to Read Before You Die is actually by a completely different author. So anyway, I still ended up enjoying the book. I actually have not finished it, but I expect to finish it today. And so far, I can just say that this is one of those books where what's happening to the people really feels like it's happening to you as you're reading it. And what happens, and this is very well known about this book for those of you, like, I'm not spoiling anything. It begins with, just seeing people in a largely populated city, and one of the people goes blind, and it's like kind of confusing because there isn't any physical reason why this person should be blind. And within a very quick period of time, this becomes an epidemic of blindness. And so what this book does is it kind of explores what people do when there are people who are less fortunate than others. It also explores what it's like to have to completely reorient yourself to the world based on losing one of your senses. The text itself, it becomes harder and harder to read as you are going deeper and deeper into the story. I don't know if that's on purpose, but for me, it does serve a purpose, for me at least. One thing about this that some people wouldn't like is that it has a lot of dialogue without quotes. Some people really don't like that. I don't mind it. It's distracting, but I don't mind it. And also this is, the community is just kind of like getting out of control in that there's some crime that's going on as a result of this, and people are taking advantage of other people. And so there's like a lot of just civil unrest. It's also a commentary on politics. It's a commentary on leadership. And basically like chaos. Because there's a lot of feelings of chaos in this book. It also feels a lot like losing control. I don't know what I'm actually going to give it, but right now, as I'm reading it, it's probably going to get 3 stars. When I first started it, I figured I would probably give it 4 stars, so it's a strong book. That's something that I can say. But again, for those of you who are really big into a lot of grammar, white space, and quotes around dialogue, if you can't do that, if you can't read a book that doesn't have a lot of white space and doesn't have quotes around dialogue and all of that, I would say to go ahead and pass on it, because there are other books that have done this a little bit better than the way this book does it. So that said, those are the books that I've read in August and what I've thought about them. I hope you enjoyed me going through this list. I'm going to go ahead and compile a list of all 10 books in the description with a link to where you can buy it. Now, those links are going to be affiliate links, and it's not going to go to Amazon, okay? It's going to go to a different place where basically if you buy any books from there, it will support small businesses, okay? It'll support small bookshops. And so I think that that's a good cause. So if you want to purchase there, just know that there will be a kickback to me, but just a small one. And I mentioned Book of the Month Club. Now I'm going to do a separate video on that sometime, but I do have a link for Book of the Month Club as well. If you use that, then you can get, I think you get it for like $5, and then you can choose to either like not get it again, or you can choose to continue to get a book every month. And basically all it does is it gives me an extra credit for a book. So that's what I get out of that. And then there's another link to Thrift Books, and that's a really great site. If you want to buy books on a budget and it's not Amazon, I would definitely say Thrift Books. And that's a link where basically if you buy $30 worth of books, then you'll get a free book. So if you want to take advantage of that, there's that too. So I'll be including some affiliate links and a list of these books in the description for those of you who want to check it out. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed spending time with me, please go ahead and like this video if you think that you would like to hear me talk about books more, and give some analysis, teach you how to analyze books, teach you how to be more mindful about reading, and talk more more about what it means to be an avid reader versus a reader, go ahead and subscribe. I'm just starting out, but I'm very excited about my channel. See you soon in another video. Bye for now.